The sun was setting. The town was silent. Wind scattered dust along Main Street. Gangs had surrounded everything. Townspeople had locked themselves in their homes. But up at the farm on the hill, Joe Madison kept his calm. He remembered what he learned 30 years ago in Fallujah. Sometimes a man must stand alone to protect what he loves, and Joe knew how to stand very well. Every story you're about to hear was earned, not given. Welcome to Earned Stories. Tell us in the comments which city you're watching from, and if you believe stories of silent protectors like Joe deserve to be told, don't forget to subscribe. In Millbrook, Montana, everyone knew everyone. A small town of 1,200 people, with shops lined along the main street, an old white church with a bell tower, and one elementary school where 3 generations had learned to read. Everyone had been doing the same job for 30 years, living in the same house their parents built, talking to the same people they'd grown up with. Joe Madison was one of them, but also apart from them. He lived on his 500-acre farm outside town, nestled at the foot of rolling hills that stretched toward the Canadian border. He grew wheat and corn in neat rows that followed the contours of the land and raised about 50 head of Black Angus cattle. At 52 years old, medium height with weathered hands and gray stubble, Joe was the kind of quiet man who measured his words like he measured seed. He'd come to town center once a week, usually on Saturday, always drove the same beat-up Ford pickup, always parked in front of Henderson's General Store. He'd buy his supplies, coffee, canned goods, fuel for the generator, greet a few neighbors with a polite nod, maybe comment on the weather, then return home before the sun got too high. Everyone in Millbrook liked Joe Madison, but nobody really knew him. He didn't talk much, especially about anything personal, never spoke about his past, where he'd come from, or why he'd settled in their small corner of Montana 25 years ago. During town council meetings, he'd sit in the back row, baseball cap pulled low, listening but rarely speaking unless someone asked his opinion directly. When the church needed a new roof 3 summers back, Joe showed up with his tools and worked alongside the other volunteers. When old Mrs. Peterson's fence got knocked down in a storm, Joe spent his Sunday fixing it without being asked. When the high school needed someone to teach kids about agriculture for their science fair, Joe quietly volunteered. He never expected thanks, never made a show of his generosity. His neighbors knew him as reliable and hardworking. That was enough for most people in a town where minding your own business was considered a virtue. Joe Madison was simply part of the landscape, steady, dependable, unremarkable. Nobody had ever seen what Joe kept hidden in his barn, carefully stored among the old wheat sacks and rusted farm equipment. Nobody could know what memories played through his mind when he sat alone on his farmhouse porch late at night, smoking his one cigarette of the day and watching the stars above the Montana plains. And nobody ever thought to question who Joe Madison really was, or what he'd done before he became their quiet neighbor. Until the gangs came. They had come from eastern Montana, working their way west like a disease. Drug trafficking, gun smuggling, extortion, human trafficking, any crime that turned a profit. Marcus "Viper" Rodriguez had built his organization methodically over 5 years, targeting rural communities where law enforcement was stretched thin and federal attention was minimal. When their operations in Billings and Great Falls attracted too much heat from state police, they decided to establish new territory. Small towns were perfect, isolated, trusting, with limited resources to fight back. Millbrook was exactly what they were looking for. Remote enough to avoid scrutiny, prosperous enough to be worth their time, small enough to control completely. Marcus Rodriguez never did unplanned jobs. He was 34 years old, a former Army sergeant who'd been dishonorably discharged for selling weapons to Mexican cartels. He understood strategy, logistics, and the psychology of fear. For 3 weeks, he and his lieutenants conducted surveillance on Millbrook, learning everything they could: who lived where, who had money, who might resist, who would cooperate out of fear. They identified the town's single point of failure, 65-year-old Sheriff Williams, a decent man who'd kept the peace for 20 years but was counting days until retirement. The nearest state police barracks was 50 miles away. The nearest FBI field office was in Billings, 2 hours by car. They cataloged every business, every potential source of revenue. Millbrook had 1 bank, 1 pharmacy, one grocery store, a grain elevator, and a small truck stop that served travelers on Highway 2. Perfect infrastructure for a criminal operation. Marcus observed Joe Madison too, the solitary farmer living on the hill outside town. Alone, quiet, older, not the type to cause problems, just another local they'd need to control but not worry about. Marcus Rodriguez had made many accurate assessments in his criminal career. This wasn't one of them. The operation began at dawn on a Tuesday in October. 5 black SUVs rolled into Millbrook like a military convoy, which in many ways they were. 15 men, all armed with military-grade weapons, all wearing tactical gear and ski masks. They'd done this before, in other towns. The shock and awe approach worked. First target, the bank. They zip-tied the manager and 2 tellers, emptied the vault, and left 2 men to guard the building. Second target, the pharmacy, where they took all controlled substances and left another guard. Third, the grocery store, which they turned into their temporary headquarters. Within 30 minutes, they controlled the town's financial center, medical supplies, and food distribution. The message was clear and immediate. Millbrook now belonged to them. The townspeople panicked, but they were helpless. The gang had cut phone lines and set up signal jammers to block cell service. Sheriff Williams found his patrol car disabled and his radio dead. When he tried to walk to a neighboring farm to call for help, 2 armed men politely but firmly escorted him home and suggested he stay there. By 10 a.m., Marcus had set up his command post in the grocery store and begun explaining the new reality to anyone who came near. Millbrook was now under new management. They would be collecting taxes, providing security, and ensuring that everyone followed the new rules. Anyone who caused problems would be dealt with harshly. Anyone who cooperated would be protected and left alone. This wasn't a robbery. This was an occupation. But up on the hill, 3 miles outside town, Joe Madison was watching through a pair of binoculars he'd retrieved from a dusty corner of his barn. Military-grade optics he'd carried 30 years ago in Fallujah and Ramadi. They still worked perfectly, still gave him crystal-clear images at long distance. Joe spent 20 minutes conducting his own surveillance, methodically cataloging what he saw. 5 vehicles, approximately 15 hostiles, military-style weapons and tactics, professional organization. They weren't amateur criminals or opportunistic thieves. This was a trained group with a clear operational plan. Joe stayed perfectly calm. He'd seen much worse situations 3 decades ago in Iraq, where he'd served 3 tours as a Marine Corps scout sniper. But this was different. This wasn't a foreign battlefield where enemies and civilians were clearly marked. This was his home, his neighbors, his community. He made his decision quickly and moved with purpose. From the back corner of his barn, behind stacks of feed bags and beneath a weathered tarp, Joe retrieved a large metal chest. Inside, carefully preserved and maintained despite years of storage, were items from another life: military radio equipment, maps, range-finding tools, and most importantly, his old companion, the M40A3 sniper rifle, custom-built for Marine Corps scout snipers. This particular weapon had served with Joe through 3 combat deployments. Even after 30 years of storage, it remained in perfect condition. Joe had never been able to explain to himself why he'd kept it, why he'd continued to clean and maintain it long after his service ended. He'd told himself it was just habit, just the discipline that military training instills. Now he understood why. When Joe lifted the rifle, 25 years disappeared in an instant. His hands found their familiar positions. His breathing automatically regulated itself. His mind shifted into the calm, focused state that had once made him one of the most effective snipers in his unit. In Iraq, this rifle had made 127 confirmed kills, 127 insurgents who would never again threaten American soldiers or Iraqi civilians. Today, Joe hoped he wouldn't need to kill anyone, but he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect his town. Joe climbed to the highest point on his property, a rocky outcrop that gave him a clear view of Millbrook's main street. The distance was approximately 850 meters, well within his effective range. Wind was coming from the west at about 5 miles per hour. Temperature was 68 degrees. Joe made his calculations automatically, muscle memory from thousands of hours of training. He could see Marcus Rodriguez clearly through his scope. The gang leader stood in front of the grocery store, gesturing animatedly as he gave orders to his men. One shot would end this immediately. But Joe didn't fire, not yet. Instead, he retrieved his old military radio and tuned it to the emergency frequency used by local law enforcement and emergency services. Several people in town would have radios capable of receiving this signal: retired military personnel, volunteer firefighters, emergency medical technicians. "Millbrook, this is Hill Observer," Joe said, deliberately disguising his voice. "Hostile force identified and targeted. Beginning counter-operation. All civilians remain in secure locations. Repeat, stay in your homes and away from windows. Situation will be resolved shortly." Joe turned off the radio and returned to his rifle. Now it was time to work. The first shot came at 2:17 p.m. Marcus Rodriguez was standing in the middle of Main Street, pointing toward the bank while talking to two of his lieutenants. The bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the pavement. Not fatal, but completely incapacitating. The gang members immediately took cover, shouting and scanning for the source of the shot, but Joe was invisible at his distance, concealed behind rocks and vegetation. Second shot, Tommy "Razor" Clark, Marcus's second-in-command, took a round through his thigh as he tried to drag his boss to safety. He went down hard, screaming. Now panic spread through the gang. They'd expected no resistance, certainly not from a skilled marksman. These were men used to intimidating unarmed civilians, not fighting trained opponents. Joe worked methodically, the way he'd been taught. Third shot disabled the gang member guarding the bank. Fourth shot took out the man at the pharmacy. Each shot was precisely placed to wound, not kill. Joe was neutralizing threats, not executing criminals. The remaining gang members abandoned their positions and ran for their vehicles, but Joe was ready for that too. Fifth shot punctured the front tire of the lead SUV. Sixth shot took out the rear tire of the last vehicle in line. The convoy was trapped. In desperation, 3 gang members tried to take hostages, grabbing civilians who had ventured too close to windows, but Joe's scope found each of them. 3 more precise shots, 3 more wounded criminals, 3 more rescued townspeople. Within 20 minutes, the entire gang was either wounded, in custody, or in full retreat. Those who could still walk had thrown down their weapons and were calling for medical attention. Sheriff Williams, who had been monitoring the emergency radio frequency, finally emerged from his forced house arrest. Despite his age, he was still a competent law enforcement officer. He quickly organized the uninjured townspeople to secure the wounded criminals and tend to any injured civilians. By 3 p.m., it was over. Millbrook was free. Joe watched the aftermath through his scope for another 30 minutes, ensuring no additional threats emerged. Then he carefully cleaned and stored his rifle, returned all equipment to its hiding place, and went back to his normal evening routine as if nothing had happened. That night, the entire town gathered in the community center. There was excitement, gratitude, and intense curiosity. Who was their mysterious savior? Who was this Hill Observer who had single-handedly defeated an entire criminal organization? Theories flew. Maybe it was a federal agent who happened to be in the area. Maybe it was a retired military sniper who lived somewhere nearby. Maybe it was multiple shooters working together. Joe Madison sat in his usual spot in the back row, listening quietly and offering no theories of his own. When people asked what he'd seen from his farm during the attack, he simply said he'd been working in his back fields and hadn't noticed anything until he heard the sirens. Nobody suspected the quiet farmer. Why would they? Joe was just Joe, dependable, unremarkable, harmless. Only one person in town had suspicions. 8-year-old Emma Collins, Sheriff Williams' granddaughter, had always been observant beyond her years. She'd noticed small things about Joe that adults overlooked. The way he moved with unconscious precision, the small scars on his hands that looked like they came from something other than farm work, the fact that he never seemed surprised by anything, as if he was always watching and evaluating. After the town meeting, Emma approached Joe directly. "Mr. Madison," she said, looking up at him with serious eyes, "was it you who saved us today?" Joe knelt down to Emma's eye level, the way he always did when talking to children. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "I'm just a farmer. Heroes are in the movies and storybooks. I'm just real." But Emma studied his face for a long moment before nodding. She didn't believe him, but she was smart enough to understand that some secrets were meant to be kept. The gangs never returned to Millbrook. Word spread quickly through criminal networks that small Montana town was protected by someone with serious skills. Other planned operations were quietly canceled. Millbrook remained exactly what it had always been, a peaceful community where people looked after each other. Joe Madison continued his quiet life. He planted his crops, tended his cattle, and helped his neighbors whenever they needed it. He never spoke about what had happened that October day, never sought recognition or thanks. But something had changed, subtly but permanently. When Joe came to town for supplies, people looked at him a little differently, not with suspicion, but with a kind kind of quiet respect that hadn't been there before. Conversations lasted a little longer. Invitations to community events came a little more frequently. Joe never acknowledged this change, but he didn't discourage it either. He'd spent 25 years being a good neighbor. Now, without anyone saying it directly, he'd become something more. A guardian, a protector, a man who could be counted on when counting mattered most. In the rolling hills of Montana, among fields of wheat and beneath endless skies, a quiet hero tends his land. He's not saving the world, just protecting the small corner of it that he calls home. And sometimes, that's exactly what heroism looks like. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that heroes walk among us every day. Look for the Joe Madisons in your own community, the quiet ones, the steady ones, the ones who never ask for recognition but are always there when you need them most. Because the greatest protectors often work in silence, their skills earned through service, their strength demonstrated through sacrifice.